convene at 11:46 on Friday, June 22nd. It is the meeting of the joint subcommittees at Austin ISD Caruth Administration Building. Thank you all for being here. And a large number of items on the agenda, but the first couple actions are to approve the minutes from the previous two meetings, and they are attached as part of our packet material. So if people want to take a few minutes and take a look at that, and then we'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed, none, okay, all passed, thank you very much. So, some meaty topics today. So y'all, that was it for y'all? Wow. I should mention that Anthony is here today in lieu of Bert. Bert is, I'm sure he's doing something very productive, but he's not here.
Just for
So,
today. He'll be
so we
here.
are very fortunate to have Anthony join us today. So thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
Okay, folks, we are going to turn to a follow-up on one of the requests that came from a previous meeting, which is asking the CFOs from the various governmental jurisdictions in town to give us an update on the tax, debt, bond strategies that each of them are anticipating, and ensure that we are collaborating, coordinating, and prioritizing and sequencing as appropriate. We can turn it over. I don't know if there's a point person out of you four talented folks. Okay, you're in charge. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, committee members. My name is Ed Vanino. I'm the budget officer for the City of Austin. With me today are Nicole Conley-Abram from the Austin Independent School District, Neil Vickers from Austin Community College, and Leroy Nellis from Travis County. We've also been in close collaboration with Central Health on this presentation, although Chief Financial Officer from Central Health, John Stevens, was not able to attend the meeting today. He is planning on attending a presentation of this same information at the City of Austin's Audit and Finance Committee meeting next week. The purpose of our presentation today is to give you a 5-year outlook on our joint jurisdictions, projected tax rates, debt positions, the timing of some potential bond and tax rate elections, and also we wanted to take a look at the potential impacts on a hypothetical homeowner or a hypothetical ratepayer living in the City of Austin. And I just would like to stress before we get into that word hypothetical is really key here, that our governing bodies have not taken any actions on any of these items yet. And so what we're trying to present really is just kind of where things look like they might be headed, how things might be shaping up, and to give you that hypothetical scenario. So starting off with the City of Austin's forecast, we presented to our City Council back in April a 5-year outlook that indicated the need of an increase in the property tax rate of 1.8 cents per $100 of assessed valuation in order to keep our projected growth and expenditures in alignment with our revenues. And over the 5-year horizon, we were projecting a 4.1 penny increase in that tax rate. Our base forecast that we present is a forecast that includes anticipated increases in wages, health insurance. It also includes increases in staffing because we're a growing city, and so it includes projected increases in population and the need to add officers, things of that nature. It doesn't project any major enhancements or new programs. It's really a base forecast. Included in that base forecast is an issuance of an additional $251 million of debt. That's debt that's already been voter approved from the 2006 and 2010 bond programs. So as those bond programs get implemented, we'll be issuing debt associated with them. Looking ahead a little bit, we continue to have discussions regarding the possibility of a November 2012 bond election. We've provided analysis to the City Council that at our current tax rate of 12 cents per $100 of assessed valuation, we would have capacity to issue another $385 million of debt without having to increase that debt portion of the tax rate. Urban rail has been discussed a lot. At this point in time, we're not anticipating it to appear on the 2012 ballot, but we do anticipate that it's going to be reconsidered as part of a future bond election, and with an estimated city contribution of $275 million in capital costs for phase 1 of that project. And I'd just say here that project we've not included in our projections. So when we get into this a little bit later and we start talking about some of our projected tax rates and impacts on ratepayers, we've not included that at this point in time. We're going to Travis County and let Leroy walk you through that slide.
Travis County, the Commissioners Court did approve our FY13 budget guidelines that allowed the Planning and Budget Office to go 3% above the effective tax rate. And as you can see, that's about a penny on the tax rate. We are projecting, or I projected, about a 3.7-cent increase over the period that ends with FY17. We have some of the same, obviously, cost drivers that the City of Austin does, health insurance, retirement, growth. Our growth parallels the population growth, and that's driving the inmate population. It drives the criminal justice system. We do, thank you. We do have various issuances. We did have a very successful bond election in November, and we do anticipate that over the period ending in 17, that we could have the possibility of issuances, not an election, of about $608 million of debt. That includes certificates of obligation, 2005 and 2011 voter-approved bonds. We also have pass-through financing road bonds, and we have the potential of issuing for some downtown building projects. Like I say, at this point, there's not an anticipation for a bond election within that 5-year period at this point. Ed.
Good morning. The scenarios that are sort of forecasted for AISD, we are assuming sort of a base case where, of course, we are holding our existing O&M tax rate constant for the remainder of the 5-year period. So our base case scenario assumes no change in the O&M. It does have some incremental decreases in the INS tax side, assuming that we run out on our existing about $229 million in bond authorization that's remaining on our 2004-2008 bond program. And so if we just looked at where we were in terms of finishing out our 2004-2008 bond programs, even with that run, we could look at sort of reducing our debt rate almost by $0.015 through the course of the 5-year period. Now, we've implemented hypothetical scenarios which could assume a tax rate election in 2013, which would affect our FY 2014 budget of 5-cent increase in the scenarios that we'll later talk about after later in the presentation. And then also some hypothetical scenarios if we were to combine that with a potential bond election in increments of either $350 million or $500 million, which would necessitate about a 2-cent increase over the base case assumption. But the 2-cent increase would be just maybe half a penny over where we currently are today. So if we held the tax rate where we were today, we're only looking at a net effect of probably a half a cent increase. And so those are sort of the scenarios that you'll be seeing later and the effects of those scenarios on the various taxpayers.
Good morning. So for ACC, we currently have a maintenance and operations rate of 9 cents. That is locally capped, so we actually cannot increase that rate without having an election. There are currently no plans to increase the maintenance or to ask for an increase in the M&O rate. So at least through 2017, we're assuming that will stay at its current 9-cent rate. As for the debt service rate, we currently levy approximately ½ cent to a service debt that was authorized in 2003. All of those bonds have been issued, so we have no authority to issue any others. There have been preliminary discussions about a GO bond election in 2014. Last year, our board adopted a 15-year facilities master plan that identified both new construction and renovations of basically all of our campuses. In that plan, it identified somewhere in the range of 500 to 600 million would be needed to accomplish the goals of that plan. That would increase our debt service tax rate by about 2.5 cents. There's really been no, while that's what the facilities plans identified, there's really been no formal discussions yet on the actual sizing in terms of the election, but that's just what the plan has identified as needed. And thank you.
All right, we're going to come back to me to kind of give you a little bit of Central Health. As I mentioned, John Stevens from Central Health was not able to attend today, but he did put together what I thought was a very well thought out and insightful email that I've distributed to you all. Essentially what it talks about is that their base forecast assumes that they're going to maintain their tax rate at the nominal level of 7.89 cents. And it also talks about, that there's been a lot of recent speculation about a potential bond program related to a medical school, and they talk about in the email that that is not something that they're currently discussing, is actually having a bond election related to the medical school. And in fact, what they're really focused on is this 1115 Medicaid waiver, which is really good news for the community, where it give us the opportunity to identify eligible projects, and essentially for every dollar that the local community spends on those eligible types of projects and activities, the federal government would kick in $1.40. So there's a lot of potential there from Central Health's perspective to really achieve some of the priorities of their board as a result of this 1115 Medicaid waiver. And they do think that there's a potential for a tax rate increase associated to that, but there's just a lot of uncertainty out there right now in regards to how that all is going to shape up and what it's going to look like. And there's a lot of partnerships involved. The city of Austin and the county and Central Health are all involved in discussions about this 1115 Medicaid waiver and how it's going to affect the region. So you all have that email before you to get some interesting information about the types of things they're looking at. And again, Mr. Stevens will be attending the Audit and Finance Committee next week to answer any questions that the council members or anybody else who's attending may have about that. Just trying to pull things together a little bit. If we go to the next slide, we try to put together just a graphic of what a timeline might look like for some of these different bond elections and tax rate elections. We are anticipating a bond election in November of 2012 from the city, somewhere maybe in the neighborhood of $385 million. Nicole talked about the potential for an AISD bond election in the range of $350 to $500 million in May. In November of 2013, AISD would potentially be looking at a tax rate election of 5 cents, and potentially somewhere around there. You can kind of see the range we're giving. Somewhere around there, we do anticipate that the discussion of urban rail will continue on, and somewhere in that window of probably after November of 2013 till, who knows when, somewhere we think that may come forward to the voters, as well as something about something from the healthcare district related to the teaching hospital or related to the 1115 Medicaid waiver. And then in November 2014, the community college looking at a bond election of up to $600 million. I'll highlight again before I go on to the next couple slides that in some of the numbers we're going to be forecasting, we are not taking into account the teaching hospital and urban rail. On this next slide, we do get urban rail in there a little bit. So what we try to do on this slide is to look at those three scenarios, really. One is just the base case. That's just kind of the way things currently are. The base scenario just assumes that that nothing on that previous slide actually gets implemented. We just kind of stick with the status quo, and you can see the tax rate pretty much would stay flat. In FY13, we're projecting a rate of 2.41, and it would still be 2.41 in fiscal year 17. The red line is kind of what we're projecting would occur. That includes the various bond elections and tax rate elections we've talked about. The red line does not include rail. It does not include anything from Central Health, and you could see we'd be projecting a tax rate increase from about 2.4 in fiscal year 13 to 2.52 in fiscal 17, and then you can see rail would add on top of that. There's a lot of numbers on this last slide. I'm certainly not going to go through all of them, but what we've done is we've tried to identify a typical homeowner, and all the jurisdictions kind of define their typical homeowner differently. And so we ended up settling on somebody who owns a $200,000 home, a home that's valued by TCAT at $200,000, and we project 3% growth in that $200,000 home each year, and take a look at what would that projected scenario look like for the typical homeowner. So again, that red line scenario where we are doing some bond programs and there are some tax rate elections occurring, not rail and not the hospital, what would be the impacts to the typical homeowner? And collectively, I would focus you on the far right column, that CAGR, that's the compounded annual growth rate. And so for the total property tax rate from all the jurisdictions, we would project a compound annual growth rate of 3.6%. So this is the impact on the pocketbook, right? This is the money that the taxpayers are paying to these jurisdictions. We projected growing by about 3.6% annually in order to fund that projected scenario. And then we also added on the City of Austin's utilities. So this would be Austin Energy and Austin Water, Austin Resource Recovery, those utilities, and what their projected rate increases are over the 5-year horizon period. We're projecting a 4.3% annual growth rate for those utilities, for kind of a grand total bottom line 3.8% annual growth for everything we can think of collectively that the taxpayers and the ratepayers pay to get the services that these jurisdictions provide. We'd be projecting an overall 3.8% growth. I think that's our last slide, and we're happy to answer any questions and open it up for committee discussion and potential action.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Let's open up for comments, questions. Dr. Christopherson.
First, I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this. I know the last time we met and we gave y'all the charge to come together and try to put all the pieces together. It's pretty dicey business with elected boards and a whole nother administration and that executive leadership to deal with. But you did a great job, and I really thank you, at least on behalf of AISD, for taking it so seriously and even adding in things that we never talked about, like the utilities and fees. It's just super smart and incredibly progressive, so thank you. And I just have one question. So you presented, again, some really good things for us to think about. We did kind of ask you, what would be your advice to us in thinking about how to work through the priorities and the needs of these various aspects of the community? Is the kind of recommendation for that this snapshot right here of the order? I mean, what did you use for criteria for thinking through how these things could work? Is this just from what you think you've heard from the entities, or is this your best guess about how we might be able to lay it out?
I think that's really what we've kind of heard, that, you've got, obviously, we went in 11 and Travis County. City of Austin's obviously posed to go in 12. The school district needs to go, and it occurred, at least from my perspective, that the school district really doesn't have all the information that they need to go to the voters for whatever they're asking for on the M&O side, in my opinion, that you need to see what the legislature's going to give you or take away from you during this session. So it would make more sense logically in my mind, and I know the heads of the elected boards are here, so this isn't I haven't conferred with Judge
Sure.
Biscoe in the court, but from but it does appear to be a logical, in my mind at least, way to lay it out, and then ACC coming in a latter year. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, yes, it does. And so part of what we've been trying to work on to, in many respects, avoid is being on the ballot even as early as November 2012 with a bunch of other entities and what the cost of that might be on Austin taxpayers. So, according to this timeline, it looks like there's really only one lead. I mean, what are y'all, I mean, do you think it's possible? Do you think it's, doable to see AISD move up to November 2012? Because according to this timeline, it looks like we might, if we waited, we would be there with the UT Medical School. Any thoughts on that?
I would just add a comment that of all the things on here that are hypothetical, that UT Medical School is probably the most hypothetical. So to the extent we're showing it as being probably somewhere after November 13, that is the one where we absolutely have no clue how big it would be or when it would be. I would just add that to your comment in regards to the timing. And there's probably others who might have a better idea of what might be happening with urban rail and when the desire to come forward with that might be.
So it might be important to connect with y'all next week after they come to the Audit and Finance Committee, because John will be there, and he probably can give a little bit more insight specifically about, is that blue line that shows the timing appropriate, or does it need to start in November 12 and move forward?
Well, they've told us that there's not going to be something in November 12 on the teaching hospital.
Okay. Councilman McCall, and then then Judge.
I just want to again applaud Ed Van Eno for his leadership in putting this together with the other taxing jurisdictions and y'all all working together to get this to this subcommittee, and also appreciate that we're hearing this information in a couple of different places at the city, and we are going to hear it on Wednesday at Audit and Finance, and we have a lot of time reserved to delve into those details and hear from all the taxing jurisdictions at that time. Ultimately, we recognize that the particular boards of each taxing jurisdictions are going to make the decisions about what their tax rate will be and when they will go out for what. But there's been a while in various subcommittees that we've been talking about how do we actually support each other and make all these things happen, and recognize that all these things need to happen, but what we really need to decide is when are they going to happen and how are we going to collaborate on our efforts. So I think the first step was getting our finance directors together to start at least communicating with each other what the various governing bodies were saying. I fully recognize the needs of not only the city but also the school district. But I did want to put on the table that November 2012 is what we call our big one. It's when we go out for the most in bonding capacity. And so that's transportation, public safety, parks, affordable housing, just citywide needs. And so we take that election very seriously, and so I'm very confident that that election will go forward in November. And we do a massive needs assessment for that. And we recognize that what the other jurisdictions plan or contemplate can have an impact on that. So it was very important to me as Chair of Audit and Finance, and to all the members, two of which are here, Councilmember Tovo and Laura Morrison, that we begin to put our minds around what the other jurisdictions were thinking. With that said, I just had one question that I wanted to ask Nicole, and that's why another reason I thought it was so important is I fundamentally do not understand what a TRE does.
Well, thank you. The previous presentation, we kind of went through our various budgeting processes and the statutory rules that surround every jurisdiction. So school districts, unlike the other taxing entities, are required by state law to basically go out for a tax ratification election anytime we exceed our current rollback rate, which is sort of set by law, anything above the 6 cents above our compressed rate. And our compressed rate is currently $1, and then you get the 6 cents up to that dollar. So that would make us, actually, I'm sorry, 4 cents up to that dollar, excuse me. So $1.04. And so anything beyond that, you have to go out for various elections. And so we went out for election in 2008 of almost 4 cents. It was like 3.8 cents. So we're at 1.079 and so in our tax rate. And so we're beyond the authorized level by the state, which would allow us to increase our tax rate without the necessity of an election. So in order for us to increase the revenue to support our maintenance and operations, we have to go out for a tax rate election. And so it has to be authorized by voters. Statutorily, we're limited to $1.17 in the tax rate. So we only have 9 cents left in remaining authorization. And in order for us to access that 9 cents, we have to hold a tax rate elections, and voters have to approve that increase in monies. And those monies support our M&O. So you all can effectively go up to, you can increase your tax rate to generate the same level of revenue that was generated in the previous year. In most cases, probably up to 8% of your M&O, your current M&O tax rate. We can't increase any amount in our tax rate without going to voters and having them authorized. So for us, if we want to generate any addition, so we've been held since 2008 at the same tax rate. And so for us, in order for us to generate new operating revenue, we would have to go out for a tax rate election in any amount beyond the current rate.
Just don't hold it against me if I ask you that question again.
And just to belabor and complicate it further, the appraisal value base, as it grows, so if there's downtown buildings, all that stuff, for the most part, the district doesn't get to capture any of that on the existing tax rate either. All of that we send is recaptured to the state. We are fixed as a target revenue system, so we get a certain amount per kid. And so even if there's appraisal growth in the tax base, we don't get to keep the taxes collected on that. That has to be sent to the state. So not only do we not raise the tax rate with that election, we don't get the benefit of the appraisal growth that occurs in our community either because of new buildings or just the value of properties. So we're pretty much at a fixed revenue. There's a little bit of tweak to that, but it's essentially a fixed revenue system. So it's a little bit of a challenge.
Morrison is looking like.
Well, I got
Can't believe that, yeah.
Judge Briscoe and then the mayor.
Speaking of voters, I'm looking at slide number 7. The Travis County Civil Courthouse is not there. Is the assumption that we would issue certificates of obligation?
That was the assumption until the court decides which way they go. The court has not, as you know, made a decision as to whether or not they will go to the voters with the civil courthouse project. We do have a Citizens Advisory Committee looking at that project currently, and will be coming back to the court sometime in July with their recommendation on a delivery method. The current projected cost of that is $338 million, and at that time, I assume that the court will consider whether or not they will. But at this point, since the court has not taken any action, I had submitted that we didn't anticipate that it would go to the voters.
But the $608 million figure on slide 3 does include that $338 million.
It does include the $338 million.
Mayor.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on Councilmember Cole's statement about our big bond election set for November of 2012. There's a likelihood that that will occur, but that decision won't be made finally until August at the earliest. But the number that Ed just mentioned, the $385 million, that is a number that would not result in a tax increase. You know, obviously I can't speak for the council. That's a decision for them to make, but I will say that for myself, my objective has been to hold our bond election to that limitation, an amount that would not hold a tax increase. So, again, the council will make that decision ultimately, but I think for planning purposes, we can work that into this mix, you know, the totality including a high likelihood that the city of Austin would not have a tax increase due to bonds in our debt service.
Councilmember Morrison.
Thank you. This is really fascinating way to look at things, and in my experience anyways, unprecedented in this community, because it's terrific to understand that people at home have one pocketbook, not 5 pocketbooks, and I think sometimes we think they have 5 pocketbooks, one for each tax bill, but that doesn't exactly work out that way. And I think that, you know, probably there's some cultural hesitancy to even have this discussion, in part because I'm already hearing, you know, we want to make sure that this is understood to be our best guess, but at this point in time, but there might be a courthouse thing, there might be central health coming in, it might be significantly changed, but to see the overall numbers and to see the annual growth rate of, you know, in the 4% range, tells us at least we're not looking at 10% and things like that. So I think that's all good. And in regard to that, and really to reference back to what the mayor has said, there is certainly going to be a lot of concern to try and keep it at 375. But I know also I'm hearing folks say that, that is bare bones and we really need to consider more. And we also we do have a 575 recommendation and a 400 recommendation from our task force that looked at this. And so, the lower one would not result in a tax increase. The higher one, if we did go with that, would result in, I understand, maybe a 2-cent tax increase. So, Ed, off the top of your head, any chance you can tell us, or maybe you could just get this to us later, I would be interested in what this slide number 9 would look like if we did have, if we did adopt the 575, so we know really what range we're looking at and what impact that would have. That would really be helpful to me in looking at where do we draw the line between 375 and 575. Would that be something you could either answer right off or do some calculations and get back to us?
Not right off, but we can absolutely do the calculations quickly and have those for the Audit Finance Committee next week, and we can circulate it to the other jurisdictions so they can pass on to their board members on this committee.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks to all of you for working on this.
Do you have some, Councilman? Okay.
I just want to add my thanks. This really is very valuable to have this information in front of us, so I look forward to our discussion again on Tuesday.
Okay. Excuse me. Okay. So one question for you, just on page 7, just make sure that maybe it's a suggestion on this timeline and a question. On the blue lines of the teaching hospital, UT Medical School, is that separate from a potential election for 1115 waiver match?
My understanding from the email John sent and from what he talked to me on the phone is that really their focus is on the 1115 waiver and what programs they could fund to take advantage of that waiver and how much those programs would cost, and that there is not a discussion right now about a bond election related to the teaching hospital at all. So I think it's really misnamed on this slide. We need to make that correction.
Yeah,
This is really 1115 waiver tax rate election.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to, because if they have a subsequent bond election at some point on the hospital, and then they also, if that's separate from the 1115 waiver match, or if somehow those two together will allow them to accomplish both, I just don't know. And again, I love the fact y'all are meeting, many of y'all next week, to have an update on this conversation, but clarification on that. And I think is, to the extent that some slide like this, if we want to get clarity on that, the civil courthouse, things that, like your blue lines that are possibles, are probably good to have on here, so we all have those on the radar. Even if when you go to the slide below, slide 8, even if they're not factored in there because we don't know, but just that way we can sort of know what's known, best guess, and then what we think that might be on the table would be great. Okay.
To come, I don't know how to get this thing. Oh, there we go. Comment about funds for the teaching hospital. It's my understanding that the teaching hospital itself is going to be funded by private donations, and the potential tax increase at whatever point they asked for that would not be for the construction of the teaching hospital. It would be for operations in the hospital ongoing. In other words, from now on.
Judge.
I was about to touch on that point. I think that's unclear at this point. We're chatting with the healthcare district next Thursday in a work session at the county, so we hope to have that clarified. But the University of Texas committed, a huge amount of money contingent upon a local contribution of a similar amount. And we need to chat about exactly what the nature of that's intended to be. So far, I think it's open, isn't it? And it could be a big deal if you issue debt, but if you do it annually, it's still a sizable increase in the budget of the healthcare district.
I've heard some numbers that have been thrown around, $35 million in local contributions, but
Annually.
I haven't heard anything specific on that.
Okay, and I know that in some respects for us as a school district, in terms of planning, it's helpful to know, because I think there was a sense that there was a lot potentially on the ballot in November, and some of that, this November, and some of that stuff is potentially slid to next year, and we don't want to create the situation where we delay this year and then all of a sudden have the same thing we deal with next November, where you've got an aggregation of a number of competing interests, at least from the perspective of the taxpayer, and potentially overwhelming them. So I think continued conversations, just as a timing thing for us as a board, and probably like y'all, we have to make a decision in August what we're going to do, if anything, for this year. But I think this process has been very helpful, because if for some reason we don't go in November, I think we'd like to be very clear when we are going to go, so everybody gets aligned and we can make sure that we're, again, sequencing and prioritizing all these things in a smart way that doesn't overwhelm the taxpayers, that actually provides the best opportunity for each of us to be successful in the various initiatives we have. Okay, this is great. Thank you all for doing this.
Thanks.
And just out of curiosity, Nicole, you can be, are you part of the group next week? So, thank you. I might, if invited. Okay, now we're going to change gears. How close are we on time? Not? Okay. We are, it looks like, Mel, we got a report on the implementation of the judicial supports. Oh, welcome. You may recall, folks, we have several different task force and initiatives that relate to the connecting of the dots, and this is one of them, which is the Judicial Supports Task Force.
Yes, my name is Barbara Swift. I'm a deputy chief with the Juvenile Probation Department in Travis County. In the absence of Judge Sines and Judy Cortez, who are the co-chairs of this committee, I was asked to give you an update based on our latest meetings. Oh, thank you. The last of which was June the 14th. We are working on we have created a work plan to try to put some timelines and tasks on getting this project implemented. The piece we're working on right now is referred to as the Neighborhood Conference Committee / Vertical Team Pilot. This involves the vertical teams that are in the schools, and the Neighborhood Conference Committee that's a project of the Health and Human Services with Travis County. The first thing that we need to get in place, we know that we're shooting for an implementation date for when school starts, and in order to accomplish that goal, we're going to have to get our funding squared away. So there's some issues that need to be addressed and some agreements that need to be put in place between the city and the county to transfer the dollars in order to fund the case managers that are an integral part of NCC. The second thing that we talked about was looking at potential referrals from the school district in order to get a better idea of the number of case managers that need to be hired. And you'll see as you go through this slide that there are some people that have been designated with responsibilities associated with each of these tasks. Some of these things will happen concurrent, because we know while we're working on the number of referrals, we also need to be looking at the referral process, which is item number 3. We want to be sure that the schools have an opportunity to identify where in their progressive discipline process would they make the decision to refer a juvenile to, or a child to, excuse me, to the Neighborhood Conference Committee. And then we want to have points of contacts or liaisons between the schools and the NCC case managers, so they can meet throughout the process and discuss a child's progress in participating in NCC, the types of referrals that are being made, and when it may be time to move on to something else if NCC happens to not work. There were principals from the vertical team schools that were present at this last meeting, and they're going to work with the NCC staff on identifying the referral process. We also, of course, want to create an evaluation plan that looks at whether or not this pilot has been successful. There's some discussion about what the elements are that we need to collect data on in order to be able to determine that. We talked about, for instance, collecting attendance data, academic performance, and behavior change. So there is a sizable group of folks that are going to meet and talk about that and try to establish whether there are existing tools that are in place where we can draw data from, as well as any additional data that might need to be collected that's new. Also, obviously, as a part of the evaluation process, there'll have to be a data sharing agreement established between the school district and the other parties to the evaluation process in order for there to be a free flow of information and data amongst all the parties. That's where we are at this point. Pardon me. These are the most important tasks that we identified in order to get us up and running as quickly as possible in line with whenever school starts.
Okay, questions or comments? Councilmember Morrison.
Thank you very much. I assume the meeting went well then. I think you had a meeting last week, is that correct?
Yes, it was June the 14th.
So it must have been very productive because it looks like you've gotten things on track to really make this happen by the coming school year, which is a bit of a short timeline, but that's great.
We're hopeful.
I'm glad to hear that. And I guess I'm want to make sure that the city provides the appropriate support for developing the interlocal agreements. And Ms. Fleming, have you been in contact with, say, Mr. Lombreras on that?
Yes, Councilmember, there's already been a city attorney assigned and lots of email back and forth to make sure all the players know who to communicate with. So I think we're on track.
Okay, and I see Mr. Snipes here too.
Councilmember, we have an actual action plan on the June 28th council that will be coming before you to transfer the dollars over to the county to cover for the caseworker.
Great, so we take action next week to
That's
get it
correct.
all in place.
That's our plan.
All right, that's terrific. And then just a general comment I want to share with you all. On last Saturday, I guess it was, the League of Women Voters hosted a dialogue, community dialogue on education. And it was a wonderful format in groups of 10 people that were from all different walks of life discussing various things. And my takeaway, they were trying to identify what are the big issues in the community about education. I know President Williams was there and Superintendent Karstafen. My takeaway.
I was there too, if we're going down the list.
Oh, Judge, I didn't see you. Anybody else there? No, I don't think you made it. Mayor, you might have been out of town.
I wasn't covering for you, sorry.
I didn't know.
So it was interesting because my personal takeaway of one of the most important issues that came out of it, and we're waiting for the league to sort of analyze it, but I did talk to them, and their guess is that this is actually going to be one of the big issues that comes out of it, is concern in the community, and frankly, from my perspective, surprise and amazement that they didn't really realize that kids are getting shifted into the court system so quickly from school to courts. I know I've heard of it referred to as, the criminalization of plain old school behavior and concern about that. So I just throw that out there that it was, I've heard talk about it because it's come up here at the tables where I was. Most people didn't have any clue what was going on, and they were stunned. And their first blush reaction is, wow, we got to find a better way to deal with this. So I won't be surprised if this raises up in visibility as a discussion item in the community, and I'm glad about that. I think that could be a good thing.
Okay, other comments or questions? Okay, I'm going to say thanks to the city and the county for partnering with us. We very much appreciate it. This is one of those where you look at schools and sort of a focal point for how kids are performing, but we know when kids are not in schools, that means they're generally going to end up someplace else that may not be school-related, and the challenge is going to be on the entire system. And so your willingness to help support us so the kids can stay in school and be successful in school is enormously appreciated. So thank you for doing that. Okay, let us transition to an update on the educational impact statement process. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And it looks like it's a possible action, so we'll have to come to what that possible action might be that y'all are looking for.
Good afternoon. My name is George Adams. I'm with the Planning and Development Review Department with the City of Austin, and I'm here on behalf of the Director, Greg Guernsey, joined by Paul Turner. We also have Julie Lipton, who's a division manager over Land Use Review Division with the city, and Beth Wilson with AASD as well. And we're here to provide a little bit of background and an update on the educational impact statement. So in terms of background, just wanted to refresh your memory. Back in March of '09, the Joint Subcommittee adopted a resolution that authorized joint subcommittees to develop policies and recommendations supportive of families and children, and to also identify, evaluate, and communicate the educational impact of land use law, policy, development, and redevelopment projects. Shortly thereafter, also in March of 2009, the Austin City Council endorsed that resolution. Then fast forward to March 2011, City Council approved another resolution which endorsed the subcommittee recommendation for an EIS with the goal of anticipating the impact of development on families and children, on families and AISD facilities, excuse me, and also making the EIS statement a part of the formal development process. So based on that direction from the council, the city adopted a rule in April, and I'm sorry, this date, that should be 2011, not 2012 on that slide. City adopted a rule implementing the EIS. There were several components to it, including submittal requirements that were added to zoning, subdivision, and site plan applications. And then laying out a process by which the EISs would be reviewed and transmitted to AISD. So just very quickly, the additional requirements that were added, the type of development, whether single family or multifamily, the proposed number of residential units, number of units that are demolished, if that is applicable to the particular project, estimated rental or sales price of units, proposed family amenities, whether those are on or off-site, and then transportation linkages with a focus on pedestrian, bike, and transit connections. As part of the rule, there was also a threshold established for the EIS, and there were two components to the threshold. The first was a minimum number of residential units, and those are identified in the slide. The minimum number of units or a minimum number of units that are being demolished. The second was that the application would require review and approval by our Land Use Commission, so either the Planning Commission or the Zoning and Platting Commission. So in advance of this meeting, we've done a preliminary analysis of the applications that we received during that April to April year that the EIS process has been in place, and I'll just walk through those very quickly. To date, we've received 49 zoning applications. 8 of those were within AISD boundaries and required the educational impact statement. 7 of those were for multifamily zoning. 1 was for a planned unit development. On the subdivision side, we've had 78 total applications. 13 of those were for 100 single-family units or more. Only 4 of those were within AISD boundaries. Of those 4, 2 were administrative approvals. 1 was a fairly minor revision to a previously approved preliminary plan, and so out of those 4, we had 1 EIS required. Finally, on the site plan or site development application side, we had 10 site plans that went to either the Planning Commission or the Zoning and Platting Commission. 5 of those are within AISD boundaries, but all 5 of those were extensions of previously approved site plans. So Typically, a site plan has a 3-year life. Within our code, it allows a 1-year administrative extension and then another year extension if approved by the Land Use Commission. And that's what was going on with all 5 of these site plans. By contrast, we had a total of 72 site plan applications during that same period that were administratively approved. And because they were administratively approved, they didn't meet one of those triggers for the EIS. Of those 72 site plans, 19 of those were in AISD boundaries and met the residential unit threshold for multifamily, which is 200 units or more. So that's just a very brief overview of where we're at in the process. We'd be glad to answer any questions, take any direction you might have on this.
Okay, thanks for the update. Just want to double check, and so maybe Mel, this question for you, or the possible action was just if for some reason the board had, this group had any direction, but at this point, there's not a request for action on anything at this point. This was an update. Okay. And I think that was similar to the CFO discussion, right? It was just if, okay. So let's open up for comments or questions. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you. Thanks, guys, for putting together the information. I appreciate it. I'm still a little confused about what we are looking for in terms of the information we're gathering in the EIS and the triggers already used to get to that point. I understand the process that you've outlined where it has to meet, obviously, within our district, certain thresholds in terms of capacity. The thing that I'm finding a little confusing is the requirement for approval by the either zoning and plating or planning. Right. And I mean, I may be unaware of it, but I thought all we were trying to do was gather information here to help the district in terms of demographic forecasts, capacity, our schools, that kind of thing. So is the requirement for the commission approvals just, I mean, how is it not a point where we're gathering data, basically?
How is that not a point where we're gathering data? Well, it certainly is. In the case of those commission-approved plans, we are gathering the data. I think maybe the missing piece is on the administrative side, where, I mean, we do provide notice to the district, and they're aware of those plans, but they may not have the same level of detail on those sorts of plans. But I think, and Paul, you can chime in if you'd like to. I think the original thinking with setting that threshold for Land Use Commission review was that there was a forum to perhaps discuss issues when they had a public hearing, if there was an issue that rose to that level.
Okay. I mean, from my history with this particular issue, I mean, I always looked at it as just simply a data gathering tool so we could get a better hold on what what was going on in terms of either removing or adding housing. And I personally think the 100 threshold limit is a little low. I mean, I know of multiple small, I guess the city would view them as nearly infill projects that are going on, where, I mean, that limit alone is going to be low enough where, we're not going to catch many of those, I don't think. But I know in the case of single-family housing that that's certainly a potential enough for us to be getting a fair number of kids in some of those, depending on the area. I would think we might want to revisit that. One of the questions I had that when I saw this on the agenda was, Mr. Turner, you may help me, or Ms. Tovo, either one. Did we actually look at a history of other communities that had done this and see what their experience was and see where their limits were?
So thanks for asking that question, because there's no, yes, we did, but, and I served as one of the community members on that work group. The other community member was Susan Moffett. And so when we looked at best practices around the country, there weren't any exact models that we could use here in Austin, because in the places that had educational impact statements, they were really using them as a means of assessing impact fees. So as far as I know, I think we're the only municipality that has an impact statement that's not designed to give us information about what kind of fees would be appropriate. We're really using it as an informational tool. But for the most part, the ideas that we gathered in terms of what kinds of things should be measured did come from some of those models that we found in other places. And it's been so long now that I've forgotten what models we looked at. I think there were some maybe in Florida and elsewhere. But our initial draft of the kinds of information that should be collected came from that kind of blast look around the country.
All right.
But I think, did you, Commissioner Snyder, Trustee Schneider, did you ask about the thresholds? Is that?
Yeah, that's something I'm a little concerned about. I mean, I personally think they're a little high, especially on the single-family side, would be my take.
I agree with you, and I think, and I can certainly go back to the research I did and see how our thresholds compared to other municipalities. But I know that I believe there were some lower thresholds discussed, and part of the concern was we didn't want, through the negotiated process that was the development of the EIS, I think the decision was arrived at to start with some higher thresholds and then reevaluate. But I concur. I think there are, I think there's an opportunity to look at those thresholds again.
Okay, other comments, questions? Councilman Toro.
Yeah, I just want to point out also that this idea initially came from some community members, which I think is kind of a nice story of how these issues and ideas come to be. And that was a discussion that happened back in 2003 over the time of the potential school closures. And a community member who now wants me not to cite him suggested it. And, it made its way through the task force reports as a recommendation for this body. And then lots of staff work has resulted in the tool we have. And so I think I appreciate you raising the question of thresholds. There are some other things that I've noticed in practice that we might want to look at. And one is instances where a zoning case may be coming through and you have a development going on adjoining tracts. And so it technically doesn't trigger an EIS, but, the common sense would dictate that those two, if a development is happening on two adjacent tracts, it probably should trigger an EIS. So that's one thing I'd like to just bring to the staff's attention, that we look at ways to adapt the rules so that it would capture those circumstances. And then we had another case recently that also didn't trigger an EIS, and I think it was a similar situation. It wasn't two adjacent tracts, but there was different zoning on each, and so they were handled as two different zoning cases, perhaps. I've forgotten the ins and outs of it. So it also didn't trigger an EIS. So again, I think the net effect of that would be the same as if it were one zoning case proceeding through council. So that's just one thing, that maybe we can think about. And I wonder, too, I've been thinking, Trustee Schneider, about a comment you made at our last meeting. And that got me thinking about whether there are hot spots throughout the district that we might want to think about, whether if there are areas, and I know there are, where you are at very high capacity, over-enrolled. I wonder if we might want to adapt the thresholds for those and how complicated that would be for staff. And on the other side, if we want to look at areas where under-enrollment is a real issue, where a loss of 30 apartments, though it doesn't rise to the threshold, could also trigger a significant impact on the school. So maybe we could just brainstorm a little bit about how complicated it would be to integrate something like that.
I'm sorry.
Oh, and just the last point I want to make, though it's not relevant necessarily to this body, but one of the things that in the course of looking at some of these cases coming through council, we realized there's really a need to assess, to expand this to other school districts. And so that's one of the things that Councilmember Morrison, you and I sponsored that resolution, I think, with probably one of our other colleagues, to have the staff look at working with the other school districts to see if they would also participate in this, because we do have some big projects going on outside the city of outside the AISD limits, but also within the city of Austin.
Ms. Schneider.
So thanks to the staff for all your work on this.
One question I wanted to ask was actually prompted by an email that the district received a couple of weeks ago. The short-term rental discussion, have you looked at this as a source of losing families and losing kids? Is that included anywhere in the discussions?
Councilmember Morrison.
If I could just jump in here, it was definitely, it's definitely been brought up as an issue, and it really raised for us, so for folks that aren't aware, what's on the table right now is to allow up to 3% of the housing stock in a zip code to become short-term rental, which obviously is going to have an effect on the schools, and it would be, it's been a bit of a discussion at the council level. Frankly, we haven't had much time to discuss it at the council level. What time did we get to that item? 11 o'clock? Yeah.
We can relate.
Yes, okay.
But
Not a good time to
similar
make discussion.
time structures.
But I can, well, two things. One, it raised the issue that in the original discussion about educational impact was not only to address and try to come together on development issues, but also, and zoning cases, but also policies that we're looking at that might affect the schools. And it seems to me, and so this pointed out that this is absolutely one of those things where it would really make sense to sit down with the school district, have our staff sit down and sort of discuss what kind of impact that might have. And I'm not sure exactly, it's a little more difficult to write a template and, of action steps to take when you're talking about policies in general. But I do think, I'm certainly concerned about that. I know Councilmember Tovo shares that concern. So I guess my question would be what kind of, so the issue in general of policies, I'd like to get on the table of how we might at least be able to flag policies to say, hey, let's at least have our staff sit down and talk about these and report back. And then this one in general, how you all, if you are interested, might be interested in conversing about that.
Ms. Snyder?
I try and stay away from policy, actually. No, I mean,
You're in the wrong position.
There's our
Right.
challenge.
writing policies. Yeah, I agree that, I mean, I think we need to have some discussion about, how we approach this and, put things, I would think that the policy end is going to come from you folks and, what you want to look at in terms of how these, I mean, whether it's short-term rentals or you go to the other extreme and you add a 400-unit apartment complex on a block or whatever it is. But, how those kinds of things are going to impact the district and how we need to formalize the communication between our staff and your staff to make sure that everything's covered in the appropriate way. I mean, I'm more of a detail person, so I'd be glad to help with that, but, I do agree that the discussion needs to take place.
So I guess there's lots of pieces here, but on the short-term rentals, if, there's, I don't even know enough about it, but I mean, whether it's a week, like South by Southwest, whether it's 6 months, a year, I mean, there's a lot of different types of things that have impact or may not have impact on schools, depending on how they're structured. I would suggest to the extent that that become an issue, and it has, I mean, there have been some folks that have weighed into the school district saying we ought to weigh in on it, but I'm not sure we've looked at that as necessarily active. But I know Mr. Waxler and others are probably happy to coordinate. If your staff goes to them and says, okay, we need to coordinate, we need to have a discussion on it, here's the issues that they're looking for input, and can it be a staff response that just informs the board? Is it something the board needs to talk about? But I don't want to meddle into y'all's, to take a position on something that really has much deeper and broader implications than probably the impact on school. It's a lot of other stuff too. But to the extent there's a specific impact that you're looking about because it relates to schools that you want to factor in, I think working through the staff and then that they can come to the board and say, do we have an opinion beyond that? And there may be individuals on the board that want to weigh in individually that may or may not be a position of the board as a whole. So I think we're happy to do that. Councilmember Torson.
Yeah, thank you, President Williams. And I'm really glad you brought that up because it was on my list of things to mention and I neglected to do so. But it was my understanding that the original resolution that was passed did talk about code amendments as well as major zoning cases. So
I believe that's correct.
So technically, what we are contemplating at council, I believe, should have triggered an EIS because it will be a code amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very glad we had this discussion because I think it is appropriate to ask the school district to perhaps provide some kind of response, or to work with our city demographer who has looked at the issue and expressed some concerns that the kind of clustering that we're seeing, not with individuals who rent out their house for 1 week, but the kind of clustering of short-term rentals that are 100% of the time, or, you know, a large part of the time being used for that kind of transitory use, could have an impact and may be one of the, not the primary reason, but a reason why we're seeing population of families with children drop in some of those neighborhoods. So thank you. I think that you've suggested a potential path forward, that we ask the staff to maybe look at this issue together and give us some assessment of how they think this code amendment might, could, or, you know, if it would have any kind of impact, and then to provide that to the board as well as to the city council before, in advance of that decision.
Great. Other comments, questions on this one? So,
President,
yeah, go ahead, Councilmember Morrison.
I just want to make sure also that we capture that the general approach, and I want to ask our staff if we could look at a means for sort of flagging a code amendment if it could potentially impact the schools in some way. I'm not sure exactly how that would look, and then see if we can't. I think it probably has to be sort of general as a process, but find out some way to make sure that we get proactive about getting our staff together on those things. And I did want to mention one other thing, back to what you said, Trustee Snyder, about the different thresholds. And it was interesting what you said. You know, it has to be going to the Planning Commission or ZAP for it to trigger an EIS. And that's from our perspective. We just want it if it's discretionary. But what I'm hearing from you is there might be cases where it's not discretionary. You just want the information, and it would be helpful to have that. And so I'm wondering if we could relook at the trigger process. And one of the balances is, of course, not overburdening the folks that are making the applications, not overburdening our staff. But I wonder if we could ask our staff to get together with the school district to explore that, removing that requirement in some cases where it's going to be helpful for you.
And again, to me, I mean, the way I had envisioned this from the discussions we've had multiple years ago now, but it's just simply a data gathering tool. I mean, you know, I'm not even looking for, you know, we guaranteed there were going to be 15 kids coming there. I mean, that's not what it's about. I mean, the guy that's building this or redeveloping or doing a he's got a pretty good idea of what kind of demographic he's going to have in there, and we can extrapolate from that and say, well, we might get 10 kids, we might get 20, but we know it's not going to be 200. You know, and it's just simply a data gathering tool that I thought would be of benefit to our process, particularly in terms of the demographics when we have to make decisions about what the capacity of the schools is going to be and where boundaries ought to be and all the other good stuff that goes along with it.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on those comments. There may be other options to facilitate that exchange of information that we need to go back and look at. There might be, you know, monthly reports, quarterly reports, those sorts of things that we could transmit to the AISD staff that would, you know, provide a lot of the information, maybe not to the same detail that we're currently getting in the EIS, but there might be other ways to get it at that as well.
Councilmember Morrison. I mean, Toro, sorry.
No worries. You know, I just wanted to share one anecdotal experience, and Trustee Schneider has captured, you know, a lot of the intent, a lot of what the intent was in providing this information was to serve as an information gathering and communication back and forth, more formalized between our staffs. Recently, we had a case come through that did not trigger an EIS, and in succession, several of my colleagues asked questions about the school enrollment, the unit count, the bedroom count at the units. And so I really just want to say that it's also, I think, gone a long way to making sure that policymakers and staff, and frankly, the developers themselves are thinking about all of these concerns. What is the current enrollment of a school? How might this particular development increase the number of families with children in the area or decrease it. And so it really is changing the conversation. So, and I think that's a great thing.
Thank you all very much. I do think this idea that, George, you talked about some sort of either periodic aggregation that lets us know that may not be to the level of an EIS detail, but gives some sense of where we are. Because, you know, lots of little small ones actually will add up. And a lot of these neighborhoods that are mature, you're not going to see big developments, but you may see a lot of infill kind of stuff that's smaller that over time has a pretty big impact. One of the things, this is just stating, I think the obvious for us is, this is a great step prospectively about what's happening. As you all know, probably the challenges we have in the school district is often what's already built, and as the census showed us, was the demographic shifts within the existing housing stock, you know, and the mix of populations and the trends that are there, and that's a little bit harder to get your hands around, and sometimes that has a bigger impact on our schools than even the new developments, as apartments change character or housing becomes, the density in living in housing becomes higher, which is our issue north of 183. No new rooftops probably in 20 years, but the schools continue to get more and more overcrowded. So I think as our staffs continue to work together on the demographic trends too, and the census obviously is a great place to start, that helps because that has an impact as well. So thank you all very much for all your effort on that. So I'm assuming we don't have any specific action, but we appreciate the conversation. I know some people are going to have to go fairly soon, so let's see if we can scoot into next two items. If y'all don't mind, even though it says Councilwoman Toll, I'm going to briefly mention that this topic, and I appreciate conversations with her and what staff on, if I'm thinking about right, where do the computer access for low-income students? This has come up in a couple of board meetings. I know Trustee Moya and others have brought up this issue because you go to some schools and we have a number of students that might have internet access when they're at school. But the digital divide is pretty substantial because the expectation and the use of technology requires more and more students to access technology when they're not at school, for research, for homework, and for a lot of our students, when they go back home, they don't have access to the internet. And the expectation is that's where you're going to get a lot of research, that's where you do a lot of your studying in some ways. I mean, a lot of textbook companies are having things online where you can get supplemental materials. And so the question was, how do we minimize that and potentially provide additional access? And I know at some point there was the City of Austin had the mesh and some other things, but there was a desire is how do we expand the access for our low-income students? And I appreciate Councilman Tovo has taken a little bit of time and thought about this already, and so I appreciate your willingness to put this on the agenda.
Thanks. And I think you've really nicely captured what the issue is and what the need is, and really this was an issue that was also suggested to me by one of our community members, Susan Moffett, who was doing a presentation in a political science class down at Aikens High School, and just took kind of an informal poll of how many students in that class had computers at home and had internet access, and of the students in that class, 2 had computers at home and none of them had internet access. And so that encouraged her to do some research on how municipalities and school districts had together tried to confront some of the challenges that I know you've been thinking about here in AISD for a long time. And so I added this to today's agenda, and I know that President Williams has done a lot of thinking about it, and I know that Susan has talked with several of the trustees about it as well. And this is really just to ask the staff to do some looking at some best practices across the country and see if there are opportunities for the City of Austin and the school district to perhaps partner on some solutions that might help begin to bridge that digital divide. Susan has done some research that I'm happy to share, but she added the caveat that it was done early last fall, and so some of it's outdated, but there are a few cities that have made some progress in this area. And I had an opportunity to talk with Assistant City Manager Bert Lumbreras. I haven't had an opportunity to talk to all of you, but and in any way that my staff can be helpful, I'd certainly offer their assistance as well.
And Sherry, we're happy to have you play as well if you would like to.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say, and the county, I absolutely believe could be a good part of that solution.
So other thoughts, Councilman Morrison?
I just want to throw out, I think this is a great thing for us to try and jointly look at. I wanted to throw out a couple of things. One, and that is that the city did a technology assessment about a year ago, so some of it's still going to be informative. It was actually, we partnered with UT to do it, and it was a lot of it was driven by our Community Technology Commission, and they're very up on a lot of the issues. So in order to get started, I would suggest trying to touch base with both of those, and that's Ms. Hawkins, who was involved in the assessment. And then just to throw out one thing, and that is that more and more of our young people, their main connection to the internet is through their mobile devices, and it's not about computers at home. So it's really, we're sort of in an evolving world here and on the cusp of something. So I think it's important that in looking at this, we try to be really broad-minded about it in terms of the technology. In fact, the technology assessment was really focused before that phenomenon came up. So a lot of it, even when it when the data came forward, was, you know, a little bit out of date already. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
So multi-pieces, device and access are both important. Other questions or comments? Ms. Schneider?
I was just going to say that I was actually at a conference about 6 or 8 years ago now where there were a number of Southern California districts that were using their schools as wireless access points for the community. But I agree with Councilmember Morrison that, I mean, I nearly think that access to either wired or wireless networks is going to pretty rapidly become very localized for on-campus use, basically. That it's going to be strictly what they can do over their 3G or 4G networks, and I mean that's the wave of the future, basically.
Yeah, so if staff's up for it, we'd appreciate y'all tackling it, looking at it. And there's, you know, there's the device, there's access, and there's what you can access. You know, one of the challenges you have sometimes, and particularly for school networks, is what we will and will not allow students to get to during school, to try to keep distractions at a minimum. And so, but if y'all wouldn't mind taking some time, come back at some point and see if there's some options that we might be available for us as a team to work on, and then what other districts and communities might be doing. Mel?
I was just going to say, this is not working, but we did have a heads up on this. We've been in touch based on direction from the superintendent with our director of technology, IT services. So he's already got a heads up on this, and if you know, we could just count on the city to give us a call, set us up, we're ready to go.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Thank you very much. And I know people are going to lose people, so I should have done this earlier, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that Edna Butts is back here, who is our intergovernmental liaison. She's joined our district from Senator Watson's staff to replace Christy Rome, and she will probably interact with all of y'all and many others and over the next few years. So we're very, very fortunate to have her join our team. So thank you for being here. I should have done that first to start out. Okay, let's move to the next item, which is the Family and Children School Work Group composition. Councilmember Tovo.
Thank you. I know we talked about this at our last several meetings, so I'll make it brief. We had agreed as a task force, as a joint subcommittee at our last meeting to kick off a work group to address, a couple issues, really to take the charge that the Families and Children Task Force left, which is to collaborate on a plan in the short term to sustain Central City schools, and over the long term to figure out whether there are some policy recommendations and some practices we could adopt to try to decrease the number of families with children moving out of our Central City. And so we agreed today to come back and suggest some names for that work group, and so I have several to suggest, and then I guess I would also suggest that we, be open to others joining that group over time.
And so I guess get interested in other people have comments, but staff, do you have an update on kind of where this is or what we need to do to get suggestions to get the ball rolling? Is there any perspective at this point?
I think we need exactly where the council members going. We need the names.
Okay.
Okay.
Got it. And I do know that Assistant City Manager Bert Lumbreras, who was not able to attend, did say he was happy to be the point person on this.
Yep. I think he's taking that lead, so thank you.
And also Shannon Halley in my office has agreed to work with them and to support that committee. The names that I would like to suggest are Susan Moffett, who I think is familiar to many of you. She served on the Community Committee on Neighborhoods and Schools, which began some of this work. Kevin Foster, who is a professor at the University of Texas with a strong interest in education. Heather Way, who served on the city's Families and Children Task Force. She is also an attorney and works at UT's Affordable Housing Clinic. Strong interest in especially issues related to families and children. She served on the city's Urban Parks Group, which looked at a lot of opportunities for the city and the school district to work together. And then the fourth name I wanted to suggest is Ed Windler Jr., who is an Austin developer, also with a strong interest of how our city is changing and the demographic trend of families with children moving out. And I think he would bring a very interesting perspective to this discussion based on the work that he does professionally.
Is there a sense of how large is the work group, the core work group, which I think is what we're talking about here first, and then there obviously will be a lot of community engagement with others around that, because you run the risk of getting it so big that it becomes unwieldy,
Right.
and there's some work that needs to get done. Is some thinking about the size of the work group?
I think staff would recommend probably no more than 5 to 7, with 9 being the absolute maximum, because you tend to have larger groups when you have a task force developing recommendations, but your implementation team should probably be significantly larger just to get things moving.
Judge? That light just went on.
Seems to me that the Commissioners Court would have to approve whatever list we come up with. But should we try to get this list as soon as possible? Is that what I'm hearing? Because we can have it on the court's agenda, not the 26th, but the next Tuesday, which is like, what, 2nd or 3rd?
The 3rd, yes.
So Ms. Fleming and I will brainstorm, and with other managers at the county, come up with 3 or 4 people?
I think if each body has 3 or 4 people, and or we can come to some joint agreement. Some of the names you've mentioned are obviously people that have, that we all know that have schools and city and stuff in kind, but I think getting some group, maybe 9 folks that would be willing to go, 'cause they may not all be able to make every meeting, so that seems like a reasonable number of folks to go.
Fine with me. Sherry and I could name some people, but if the Commissioners Court were to reject our list, it would be embarrassing, not for us, but for those individuals.
And for the court members that rejected it, that didn't realize the insight that you brought to the selection process.
Absolutely.
Councilman Morrison.
I do want to throw out a couple of other names for us to consider, and I realize we need to share them around, but just to let you know a couple, one person I thought of is actually a woman that works for the city. Her name's Nadia Barrera. She lives in Montopolis, which is nice to get that perspective. But she works in neighborhood connectivity and bicycle programs, safe routes to schools, and so it seemed like she could be a really interesting addition. And then secondly, and this one depends on how much work it's going to be, so maybe, especially if we have too many names, to go ahead and make it as a second priority. And that was Maureen Matoya, who she's a student at the LBJ school and has done a lot of analysis on demographics. You all probably know her. She was involved in she's on the board of the Heritage Society, but interested in moving beyond just those kinds of things, and is very concerned. She has young children, not quite yet in school. I guess one of them already is, and says she sees all of her peers, i.e. people in her age bracket with young kids, moving out of the district because they're afraid to be, they think the schools aren't good enough. They're leaving the urban core, and she knows that is it's a trend we need to stop. So she's very interested in that.
So I think maybe we can also brainstorm some initial names, see if there's some people, and then try to create a core group of folks, and hopefully somebody's name got mentioned today, and that ultimately not, make the group, because we got to balance it with all that they know we still love them and that we would like them to participate in the process, but they may not. That doesn't mean that not on the core group doesn't mean you're not part of the broader team. So if we can, in whatever the time frame is, if there's a couple suggestions that we think, I'm certainly comfortable with the names you suggest. But there may be some others that come up as well.
And I should have indicated, too, that I did connect, actually, because I was out of town, one of my staff members had an opportunity to talk with Trustee Bradley earlier this week, and I think she was perhaps going to forward some names. So, I think that in the past, we've handled it rather informally in terms of the work group, and they've ranged from, the one I mentioned where we had 2 community members to some larger ones. So if it's, we might consider sort of keeping these names and agreeing to the names that the county commissioners bring forward and any additional from AISD, and if that's pleasing to the body, we might just begin
It's okay.
there, and then, there tends to be a little self-selection about this kind of process. I think it will be a pretty, hopefully, a pretty active group, and there may be some people who begin and realize that it's a little more work than they anticipated, or,
Can't imagine that ever happening. Okay, that's a good idea.
So do we believe this group needs resources, or will they be all right if left alone?
Well, initially, if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like staff is sort of being released to pull the names together, and then actually invite these individuals to a meeting to discuss what sounds like their charge may be. And so initially, we will begin, as we've begun other task force with the resources of the three entities, being available to support them. Should we find that we need something more than that, I'm sure we will come back and let you know.
It's a very good question, though. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, just we'll add it to our connecting the dots umbrella, however, whatever phrase we want to use, this is one more, but thank you for doing that. So,
and I would just add too, I know that we have asked the staff to undertake multiple initiatives, and I really appreciate that you may be feeling overburdened. And so in selecting, suggesting some names, I've tried to also be mindful of that. And my hope is that this work group will, draw on resources and be in great communication with the staff of the county, the school district, and the city, but also function, to some extent as independently as possible, so that they are not, overtaxing our staff.
there's a lot going on. So thank you all for continuing to take on more, but I think that's a very good point. It's getting some people who are pretty self-sufficient to be able to keep the ball rolling, keeping people informed, not going off completely
That's right.
rogue.
That's
but
right.
These are hardworking public servants before us.
Yep.
I'm proud to be associated with them.
It's like an applause line. We should, all of us should have said that, so thank you.
And I
Okay.
meant it.
Thank you, Judge.
So is that the general approach? We're going to send those
Okay.
folks forward?
Yep, I think that's okay.
And I've been explaining to people that likely their work wouldn't begin until the end of the summer. I think that's probably the most reasonable, if that sounds reasonable to the rest
And I
of you
think,
all.
was this the one that Bert was taking the lead on, at least? So if he can take that, kind of be the point person
Yep.
to coordinate that, and then the ball gets rolling, hopefully they can move forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Just, we got a couple items just for our typical updates that are part of our packet. If you'll look at just some information that was provided. If you have any, you can scan it. If you have any questions, you can ask. Then we have one announcement. Councilmember Tobo. You the Youth Summit? Who's doing it? Councilmember Morrison?
I'm going to let Councilmember Morrison talk about it since I've talked a bunch. This is the Youth Summit, and this is, she's going to distribute, I'll narrate for her while she distributes the resolution.
Sure, just by way of a little bit of background, when we had a council retreat a while back, one of the issues that came up was to try to get a grip on what are our youth services that we provide at the city, how do we prioritize them, what the funding is, and all of that. And there was a lot of discussion and follow-up, and what really sort of rose to the top is we need to be able to have a more collaborative conversation among all the partners that serve our youth in the community, to see if we can't get a better grip on who's doing what kind of programming gaps there might be, and where we have opportunities to leverage things we're doing together already. So from that came the idea that, with Councilmember Tovo and myself, that we at the city would host a youth summit to gather everybody to come together to have that discussion, just a one-day discussion. And so we are taking a resolution to our colleagues next Thursday. This should be posted already, and that is to actually work on hosting such a youth summit. So it would be obviously with partners that are here, as well as nonprofit organizations and all the other folks that are involved in serving our youth in the community. That's going to help us do our job, because we need to figure out what's the best way to spend our money and program the resources we do have. So I guess you'll be getting a save the date sometime in the future, assuming this passes next Thursday. We have our fingers crossed. Yes.
Okay, that's great. Any other announcements? Okay, Thank you all very much. Thanks to the team for all of your good work. Thanks to Judge and County and the city folks for you all being here again. And the next meeting is September 28th, and I'm not sure we know where it's going to be yet. Do we know yet?
It'll either be at the city or the county.
Okay, so y'all get to host next time, and one of y'all will be in charge. So thank y'all very much. It is 1:16. We are adjourned.